We now want to look at the relationship between society and ethics. We're going to start by asking the question, what exactly is society? We can say that society is an ordered community of free persons. We can ask ourselves, is society really important to us? It turns out that as far back as Aristotle, people were considering that the special thing about humans was that they were social animals, social creatures. More recently, sociologists have discovered through field research that humans brought up to maturity without adequate contact with society are stunted in their growth, usually don't have long life expectancies, and often don't behave anything like what we would come to think as humans. They can't walk upright, they can't speak, they tend to eat very, well, for our purposes, rather poorly. The conclusion from sociology is that society forms humans and actually enables them to act in the way that we associate with being human. So society, one way or another, is important to people. The next question is, what does orderly mean? It can really only mean in some way predictable and operating in some trustworthy manner. Society, one way or another, is made up of people, of persons. And that raises the question of what is a person? Are dogs and cats or rose bushes people? There is something about the human person that makes them social, and the organisation of a human society is different to, say, a hive of bees or a pride of lions. Connected with this notion of uniquely human societies and communities is the importance of freedom. We need to look at freedom to see why is it important to society and to ethics. What we can conclude is that ethics are principles for the free, orderly, social action that realises the common good. Common good here refers to a rather general concept, which is not the personal good of me or you, it's the good of our community as a whole. You're coming along to be a part of a class. Really, it's a little educational society. And if we all work well together, I give you ideas, you learn them, apply them, whatever, then we end up with a good outcome. You're able to go out into the world educated as a property economist. In more general terms, in larger society, the common good is that manner in which the society realises the happiness, the maximum happiness of its members. Often that means realising or making decisions for the good of the community, which might be personally inconvenient. Driving on the left-hand side of the road may not always suit me, but one way or another, it makes for a more orderly society. It stops all the other people on the road from having to drive off in every direction because of my personal choices in where I drive, that sort of thing. When we look at society, we find that sociologists have observed that there are different types of societies. But it comes down ultimately to two different types of society based on two different understandings of what the human person is. One view of what people are is that they're rational, self-interested individuals. And for those of you who have done economics, you may remember or recall that the economic actor, Homo economicus, is known as a rational, self-interested individual. And if we are no more than rational, in other words, we always follow kind of logic, then we'll always act for our good, really independent of what's happening around us. In that world, with that anthropology, that theory of the human person, we would say that morals are personally chosen by the individual, and there would be no moral universals because it's really every person for themselves. The alternate anthropology, which is most evident these days amongst indigenous people, is that people are social creatures who thrive when practicing common customs. And for them, their ethics tend to come more from their customs and traditions, and the individuals see themselves as becoming more virtuous, whatever, and more valuable, more important. They have more self-respect, not for what they individually own or individually achieve, but rather what contribution they make to their community. It gives you a completely different form of society. If we look at these two different approaches to society, we can come to some immediate conclusions. Firstly, we can see that ethics cannot be a personal choice. It really suggests that there are decisions that one has to make to act outside of one's self-interest. And this takes us back to the API's comment about acting for the client's interest rather than one's own. Ethical reasoning, one way or another, must be about finding and not making morals. Because if I simply make my own moral framework up, it's likely to be biased towards my inclination towards self-interest. Again, violating that expectation of the API, but also the expectation of most people that you would meet in the society. It gives rise to two classes of ethical systems. Systems that are the subject of the human person, in other words, they're made by the human individual, so they're created by the moral actor. I decide on my morals, I decide whether murder or telling lies or what have you is good or bad for me, and there's really no absolute good or bad. Lying just happens to be my social custom. You might come from a different society, that sort of idea. Most of you would have heard that. As opposed to ethical systems that are freestanding, what we call objective. They come from the way the world is, the actual facts and nature of the matter. If it turns out that murdering people and telling lies and what have you is something which can be understood by understanding what is actually out there, a scientific approach if you like, then it means that appropriate relations between people, those principles for appropriate action, are found and accepted by the moral actor. They're not actually made. Let's look at the history of civilization, trust, and ethics. Civilization is something a little bit different to society. Civilization is that arrangement of human persons where individuals may have a high level of trust in the appropriate action of others. I can have a pretty wild and woolly society which is not very civilized, in which case I probably have to spend a fair bit of my energy taking precautions against the unexpected things, usually unpleasant things, that others might do for me. In a civilized society, I would expect to be able to walk down the street or live my life relatively peacefully, with not having to devote a great deal of energy to self-defense. It's an environment where one has the freedom to flourish, to be the best you can. And when we look through history, we'll see that places where we've had the least civilization are the places where people have had the most miserable lives. Civilization has something to do with being able to make expectations of those around us. It's got to do with trust. Again, this echoes back to the API Code of Ethics. Trust cannot be forced on somebody else. I can't force you to trust or to be a trustworthy person. You can't, in a sense, force trust upon me. It's something that is somehow almost part of the social civilized atmosphere. It comes from confidence in the unexpected goodwill of the other that, through habit, becomes expected. And having that level of trust, that level of expectation, is really a sign of civilization. Let's look now at the ethical moral systems. We can see that there have been many ethical systems down through history. They really come down to two categories, and we've mentioned those already. It also lines up with two societies. The sociologist Ferdinand Tönnies described these two societies in using German terms, either Gemeinschaft or community-like societies, where you have a strong customary ethic linked to stable objective values, or a Gesellschaft society, so a society which is more like a club, where the individual gets their joins the club, the society, out of what they can get out of it, and on the moral calculus that what they put into it is no more than what they get out. Hopefully they get out a lot more than they put in, that sort of thing. In the same way that we might join a football club or a sports club or something, where we join the club and maybe change our membership depending on which will give us the best value. That's rather different to the the community type association, which tends to be more like a family. You're born into it, and one way or another you have to accept its existence and then define yourself around it. So this Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft are sociological terms which describe most of the societies which have existed down through history. Other sociologists have used this notion of community versus association as metaphors for society, Gemeinschaft versus Gesellschaft, to look at the fortunes of societies through history. Carl Zimmermann, a sociologist of the 20th century, looked at the history of the great civilizations of the West, and he noticed that the Gemeinschaft type of ethic of society existed in early Greece up until about the time of Aristotle, Plato and Socrates. Those three thinkers, who tend to be the Greeks who have given us the beginnings of social and moral thought, was changing in their period in history. It was really going from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft. The curious thing about the Greek culture is that while it made that transition at a time when Greece was at its cultural peak, its economic peak and its political peak, somehow riding on that peak when everything was comfortable and good, the Greeks changed their ethical system to something a bit more subjective and individualistic, and Greece became weaker and eventually faded out of history. And that's shown on this timeline where the fortunes of Greece are rising in the orange line, and eventually they sort of fade out. They were replaced by the Romans. The Romans, at the time when they were taking over Greece, also had a Gemeinschaft society and objective ethics. By the time you get to around 150 BC, the Roman Gemeinschaft ethic was being superseded by Gesellschaft ethic, and the Stoic writers, including Cicero, are representative of thinkers who were attempting to reclaim the Gemeinschaft values in a Gesellschaft society. And while Rome continued to flourish politically for a time and economically, relatively soon after it started to decline in political and economic terms. The dotted line here represents its moral decline as the Gesellschaft values, the individualism, gave way to many practices in Rome that were really quite antisocial. You had emperors poisoning each other and things like that. The end of Rome saw the beginning of the Dark Ages, which was a period of rather low civilization in Europe that extended from roughly the 5th century up until around the beginning of the 9th century. When you get to the beginning of the 9th century, the year 800 AD, you had the event of Charles the Great reunifying the Western Roman Empire in a new empire that was led by Germanic culture. The Germans had been coming into Rome for centuries, being basically invited into the Rome to do things like run their armies. By the time you get to 800, Rome as a political force had long gone, and Charlemagne, as a relatively, well, I won't say small-time king, but a ruler, was able, through his military exploits, to reunify Western Europe. And it's really where we get Western Europe from. From about that time onwards, and pretty much driven by the Germanic ethic of solidarity, we had the progressive civilization of Europe, the re-civilization of Europe, in a period which is known as the Middle Ages. And we have improvements in the political, economic, and cultural life of Europe as a result, and really the formation of what is now known as Europe. That period of cultural growth tended to have a turning point at the beginning of modernity, around the year 1500, especially with people such as Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli. Machiavelli reintroduced the idea of subjective ethics. He wrote an important book known as The Prince, or called The Prince, in which he argued that the leader of society should cultivate the power to do wrong in order to achieve his political ends. If you translate that, it simply means that in order to get what you want, in other words, political advancement, you should be willing to do whatever it takes, including deception, fraud, whatever you. And so Machiavelli's Prince, while it's a very famous book, you can download it off the internet and read parts of it. I recommend that you read chapter 14, for instance. It makes for a rather colourful set of moral principles and ethic for princes. And given that Machiavelli is known as the father of modernity, being familiar with Machiavelli and the Prince, let's say chapter 14, doesn't take long to read, you can understand why the moral fibre of Europe began in a very different direction, one which favoured individualism to the point now where we think that individualism is very much the way to go, but it also transformed Europe into a trajectory towards Gesellschaft, cultural organisation, social organisation. Now, Europe, of course, has continued to flourish well past Machiavelli. However, there is a certain question many people are asking today, especially when you look at the condition, the social condition, the law and order issues and so on that are erupting in many parts of the world. And we don't have to look simply to the United States, but we look to Europe and also parts of Australia, where 50 or 60 years ago, all of the capital cities of Australia were safe places for people to be out at night, whereas now our major capital cities are becoming quite dangerous in certain parts. There are indications that something is changing in our society, and unfortunately it's something rather ugly. Is the trajectory of the West similar to that of Rome and Greece? Well, someone like Zimmerman would say there's a certain similarity and point to the way that there is something awkward about Gesellschaft society in terms of its capacity to support civilization. What we can conclude from this brief waltz through history is that people tend to flourish under objective ethics. It's a civilizing influence. Comfortable societies, though, tend to breed subjective ethics. they tend to transform themselves from Gemeinschaft to Gesellschaft societies at the peak of their material success. And once transformed, subjective ethical systems tend to destroy civilizations. Sociologists who have studied this issue are finding it difficult to find examples of societies once transformed to subjective ethics that have actually survived the test of time.